1066 and all that. A memorable history of England, comprising of all parts you can remember, including 103 good things, 5 bad kings, and 2 genuine dates. By Walter Carruthers Sellar and Robert Julian Yeatman. Illustrations by John Reynolds. 1066 and all that. Chapter 1. Caesar invades Britain. The first date in English history, in 55 BC, in which year Julius Caesar, the memorable Roman emperor, landed, like all other successful invaders of these islands, at Thanet. This was in the olden days, when the Romans were a top nation on account of their classical education, etc. Julius Caesar advanced very energetically, throwing his cavalry several thousand paces of the river Flumen. But the ancient Britons, though all well over military age, painted themselves true blue, or woad, and fought as heroically under their dashing queen, Wodica, as they did later in thin red lines under their good queen, Victoria. Julius Caesar was therefore compelled to invade Britain again the following year, 54 BC, not 56, owing to the particular Roman method of counting. Having defeated the ancient Britons by unfair means, such as battering rams, tortoises, hippocausts, centipedes, axes, and bundles, set the memorable Latin sentence, Vini, Vidi, Vici, which the Romans, who were all very well educated, construed correctly. The Britons, however, who of course still used old pronunciation, understanding him to have called them Weenie, Weedy, and Weeki, lost heart and gave up the struggle, thinking that he had already divided them all into 3 parts. Culture amongst the ancient Britons. The ancient Britons were by no means savages before the conquest, and already made great strides in civilization. E.g., they buried each other in long round wheelbarrows, agriculture, and burnt each other alive, religion, under the guidance of older Britons called Druids or Eisteddfods, who worshipped the middle toe in the famous Druidical churchyard at Stonehenge. The Roman conquest was, however, a good thing, since the Britons were only natives at this time. The Roman occupation. For some reason, the Romans neglected to overrun the country with fire and the sword, though they had both of these. In fact, the conquest they did not mingle with the Britons at all, but lived in semi-detached life in villas. They occupied their time for 200 or 300 years in building Roman roads and having Roman baths. This was called Roman occupation, and gave rise to the first memorable Roman law. He who bathes first, bathes fast. Which was a good thing, and still is. The Roman roads ran absolutely straight in all directions, and led to Rome. The Romans also built towns wherever they wanted, and, in addition, a wall between England and Scotland to keep out the savage Picts and Scots. This wall was a work of memorable Roman Emperor Balbus, and thus was called Hadrian's Wall. The Picts, or painted men, were so called to distinguish them from Britons. Chapter 2. Britain conquered again. The withdrawal of the Roman legions to take part in Gibbon's decline, and the fall of the Roman Empire, due to a clamour amongst Romans for pompous amusements such as bread and circumstances, left Britain defenceless, and subjected Europe to that long succession of waves, of which history is chiefly composed. While Roman Empire was overrun by waves not only of Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and even Goths, but also of Vandals, who destroyed works of art, and Huns, who destroyed everything and everybody, including Goths, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and even Vandals. Britain was attacked by waves of Picts, and of course Scots, who had recently learned how to climb the wall, and of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who, landing at Thanet, soon overran the country with fire, and of course the sword. Important note: the Scots, originally Irish but now Scotch, were at this time inhabiting Ireland, having driven the Irish Picts out of Scotland, while the Picts, originally Scots, were now Irish, living in brackets, and vice versa. It is essential to keep these distinctions clearly in mind, and vice versa. Humiliation of the Britons. The brutal Saxon invaders drove the Britons westwards into Wales and compelled them to become Welsh. It is now considered doubtful whether this was a good thing. Memorable among the Saxon warriors was Hengist and his wife, of course. Horsa, Hengist, made himself king in the south. Thus Hengist was the first English king, and his wife, of Horsa, was the first English queen, or horse. The country was now almost entirely inhabited by Saxons, and was therefore renamed England, and thus, naturally, soon became C of E. This was a good thing, because previously the Saxons had worshipped some dreadful gods of their own, called Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Chapter 3. The Conversion of England. Noticing some fair-haired children in the slave market one morning, Pope Gregory, the memorable pope, said, in Latin, "What are those?" And on being told that they were angels, made the memorable joke, "Non angeli sed angeli," not angels, but Anglicans, and commanded of his saints called St. Augustine to go and convert the rest. The conversion of England was thus effected by the landing of St. Augustine in Thanet and other places, which resulted in the country being overrun by a wave of saints. Among these were St. Ive, St. Pancras the Great, St. Bernard, the originator of the clerical collar, St. Bede, St. Ebb, St. Newt, who invented whiskey, St. Kit and St. Kin, and the venomous Bede, author of the Rosary. England was now divided into 7 kingdoms. So ready were the English to become C of E, that only one memorable occasion a whole kingdom was easily converted by a sparrow. Wave of Egg Kings. Soon after this event, Egg Kings were found on the throne of all these kingdoms, such as Egbird, Egbreath, Eggfroth, etc. None of them, however, succeeded in becoming memorable, except in so far as it is difficult to forget such names as Egbirth, Egbread, Eggbeard, Eggfilth, etc. Nor is it even remembered by what kind of egg death they perished. Chapter 4. Britain conquered again. The conversion of Britain was followed by wave of Danes, accompanied by their sisters or sagas, and led by such memorable warriors as Harold Falsetooth and Magnus the Great, who landed correctly in Thanet, overran the country right to left with fire and, according to certain obstinate historians, the sword. After this, the Danes invented a law called Danelaw, which easily proved that since there was nobody else alive there, all the right-hand part of England belonged to them. The Danish conquest was, however, undoubtedly a good thing, because although it made the Danes a top nation for a time, it was cause of ALFRED the Cake, and, in any case, were beaten utterly in the end by Nelson. By this time, the Saxons had already become old, like the Britons before them, and were called Ealdormen. When they had been defeated in battle by the Danes, they used to sing little songs to themselves, such as the memorable fragment discovered in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Old Saxon fragment. Sign a song of Saxons, in the wapestake of rye, 24 ealdormen, too old to die. The Danes, on the other hand, wrote a very defiant kind of epic poetry, e.g. Beoldeopard, or Witan's Wail. When Canute Kning the Witan would enviof, of infant thief, outfang thief, wonderlich were they enraged, and word war waged. Swear Canute, great Scot and Lot, swing word ich this ill-begotten lot. Wroth was Canute, and wroth word spake, well word he win, at Wopan take. Fain would he break frith, and crack heads, and then they should worship his reds. Swinged Canute Kning with swung sword, howled Witan hell, but hearkened his word. Muri sang Canute Kning, outfang thief is damn good thing. Chapter 5. Alfred the Cake. King Alfred was the first good king, with the exception of good King Wenceslas, who, though he looked fourth, really came first. It is not known, however, what King Wenceslas was king of. Alfred ought never to be confused with King Arthur, equally memorable, but probably non-existent, and therefore perhaps less important historically, unless he did exist. There is a story that King Arthur once burnt some cakes belonging to Mrs. Girth, a great lady of the time, at a place called Atheling. As, however, Alfred could not have been an incendiary king, and a good king, we may dismiss the story as absurd, and in any case the event is supposed to have occurred in a marsh, where the cakes would not have burnt properly. So forth the famous lines of poetry about King Arthur and the cakes. Then slowly answered Alfred from the marsh. Chapter 6. EXGALAHAD and the British Navy. King Arthur invented conferences, because he was secretly a weak king, and liked to know what his memorable 1,001 knights wanted to do next. As they were all perfectly jealous knights, he had to have the memorable round table made to have the conferences at, so that it was impossible to say which was the top knight. He had a miraculous sword called EXGALAHAD, with which he defeated the Danes in numerous battles. In this he was also much assisted by the marine inventions, including the water clock and the British Navy. The latter invention occurred as follows. Alfred noticed that the Danes had very long ships, so he built a great many more, much longer ones, thus cleverly founding the British Navy. From that time onwards, foreigners who, unlike the English, do not prefer to fight against long odds, seldom attack the British Navy. Hence the important international law called Rule Britannia, technically known as the freedom of the seas. Humiliation of the Danes. The English resisted the Danes heroically under Alfred, never fighting except against heavy odds, till, at a memorable Peace of Wedmore, Alfred compelled the Danes, who were now, of course, beaten, to stop being Danes and become English, and therefore C of E, and get properly married. For this purpose they were made to go back and start again at Thanet, after which they called in future Thanes instead of Danes, and were on our side, and in the right and very romantic. Chapter 7. Lady Windermere, Age of Lake Dwellers. Alfred had a very interesting wife called Lady Windermere, Lady of the Lake, who was always clothed in the same white frock, and used to go bathing with Sir Lancelot, also of the lake, and was thus a bad queen. It was also in King Arthur's time that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was published. This was the first English newspaper, and had all the news about his victories, and Lady Windermere, and the cakes, etc. Chapter 8. Ethelred the Unready, a weak king. Ethelred the Unready was the first weak king of England, and was thus cause of a fresh wave of Danes. He was called the Unready because he was never ready when the Danes were. Rather than wait for him, the Danes used to fine him large sums called Danegeld for not being ready. But though they were always ready, the Danes had very bad memories, and often used to forget that they had been paid the Danesgeld and come back for it almost as if they sailed away. By the time Ethelred was always unready again. Finally, Ethelred was taken completely unawares by his own death, and was succeeded by Canute. Chapter 9. Canute, an experimental king. This memorable monarch, having set out from Norway to collect some Danegeld, landed by mistake at Thanet, and thus became king. Canute and the Waves. Canute began by being a bad king, on the advice of his courtiers, who informed him, owing to a misunderstanding of the rule Britannia, that the King of England was entitled to sit on the sea without getting wet. But finding that they were wrong, he gave up this policy and decided to take his own advice in future. Thus originated the memorable proverb, "Paddle your own Canute," and became a good king and C of E, and ceased to be memorable. After Canute, there were no more aquatic kings till William IV. See later, Creation of Peers. Canute had 2 sons, half a Canute and part a Canute, and 2 other offspring, rather a Canute and hardly Canute, whom, however, he would never acknowledge, denying to the last that he was their father Canute. Chapter 10. Edward the Confessor. On his death, Canute's kingdom was divided between 2 further sons, who had been previously overlooked, after Canute and Harold Hairbrush. These were succeeded by Edward the Confessor. It was about this time that the memorable Macbeth, Ian Hay, known as the Bane of Fife, murdered a number of his enemies, including Macduff, Lord Dunsinane, Sleep, etc. Edward the Confessor was, with difficulty, prevented from confessing to all these and many other crimes committed in his reign, as he was in the habit of confessing to everything, whether he'd done it or not, and thus was a weak king. The last English king. With Edward the Confessor perished, the last English king, viz. Edward the Confessor, since he was succeeded by waves of Norman kings, French, Tudors, Welsh, Stuarts, Scottish, and Hanoverians, German, not to mention the memorable Dutch king, William man Merrie. Chapter 11. William I, a conquering king. In the year 1066 occurred other memorable date in English history, viz. William the Conqueror, 1066. This was also the Battle of Hastings, and was when William I, 1066, conquered England at the Battle of Senlac, 1066. When William the Conqueror landed, he lay down on the beach and swallowed 2 mouthfuls of sand. This was his first conquering action, and was in the south. Later he ravaged the north as well. The Norman conquest was a good thing, as far from this time onwards England stopped being conquered, and thus was able to become a top nation. Doomsday Book and the Forests. William next invented a system according to which everybody had to belong to somebody else, and everybody else to the king. This was called the feudal system, and in order to prove that it was true, he wrote a book called the Doomsday Book, which contained an inventory of all the possessions of all his subjects. After reading this book through carefully, William agreed with it and signed it, indicating to everybody that the possessions mentioned in it were now his. William the Conqueror, 1066, is memorable for having loved an old stag as if it was his father, and was in general very fond of animals. He therefore made some very just and conquering laws about the forests. One of these laws said that all the forests and places which were not already possessions belonged to the king, and that anyone found in them should have his ears and legs cut off. These belonged to somebody else, under the feudal system anyway, and, if this had not already been done, should have his eyes put out with red-hot irons. After this, the offender was allowed to fly the country. Another very conquering law, made by William I, said that everyone had to go to bed at 8 o'clock. This was called the curfew, and was a good thing, in the end, since it was the cause of Gray's energy in the country churchyard at Stoke Penge. Although, in all these ways, William the Conqueror, 1066, was a very strong king, he was eventually stumbled to death by a horse, and was succeeded by his son Rufus. Chapter 12. Rufus, a ruddy king. This monarch was always very angry and red in the face, and was therefore unpopular, so that his death was a good thing. It occurred in the following memorable way. Rufus was hunting one day in the New Forest, when William Tell, the memorable crackshot, inventor of the crossbow puzzles, took an erring aim at a reddish apple, which had fallen onto the king's head, and shot him through the heart. Sir Isaac Walton, who happened to be present at the time, thereupon invented the law of gravity. Thus was the reign of Rufus brought to a good end. Chapter 13. Henry I, a tragic king. Henry I was famous for his handwriting, and was therefore generally called Henry Beaugeist. He was extremely fond of his son William, who was, however, drowned in the White City. Henry tried to console himself for his loss by eating a surfeit of ALFRED. This was a bad thing, since he died of it, and never smiled again. Chapter 14. The dreadful story of Stephen and his aunt Matilda, or Maud. The moment Stephen came to the throne, it was realized that he was a mistake, and had been christened wrong. Thus everything was thrown into confusion. Stephen himself felt quite uncalled for, and even his aunt Matilda was able to take him in when she began announcing that she was the real king. Stephen, however, soon discovered that she had been mal-christened too, and was unable to say for certain whether her name was Matilda or Maud. After this, Stephen and Matilda, or Maud, spent the reign escaping from each other over the snow in nightgowns, whilst God and his angels slept. Taking advantage of this lax state of affairs, the barons built a surfeit of romantic castles, into which they lured everybody, and then put them to the torture. Nor is it recorded that the sword was once sheathed right to the bottom during the whole of this dreadful reign. Hence the memorable greeting too common among the barons of this time, Merry Englande. Chapter 15. Henry II, a just king. Henry II was a great lawgiver, and it was he who laid down the great legal principle that everything is either legal or, preferably, illegal. He also made another very just arrangement about trials. Before Henry II's time, there were two kinds of legal trial: A, the ideal, and B, the combat. The ideal form of trial consisted in making a man plunge his head in boiling ploughshares, in order to see whether he had committed a crime or not. According to Henry's reformed system, a man was tried first by a jury of his equals, and only had to plunge his head into the ploughshares afterwards, in order to confirm the jury's opinion that he had committed the crime. This was obviously a much better thing. The combat was a system by which in civil cases the litigants decided their dispute by mortal combat, after which the defeated party was allowed to fly the country. But Henry altered all this, and declared a grand jury must decide first what the parties were fighting about, a reform which naturally gave rise to grave discontent amongst the barons, who believed in the combat, the whole combat, and nothing but the combat. Thomas A. Belloc. It was at this time that Thomas A. Belloc, the great religious leader, claimed that clergymen, whatever crimes they may commit, could not be punished at all. This privilege, which was for some reason known as the benefit of clergy, was in full accord with the devout spirit of the age. Henry II, however, exclaimed to some of his knights one day, "Who will rid me of this Chesterton beast?" Whereupon the knights pursued Belloc and murdered him in the organ at Canterbury Cathedral. Belloc was therefore made a saint, and the knights came to be called the Canterbury Pilgrims. Shortly afterwards, Henry died of despair on receiving the news that his sons were all revolting. Chapter 16. The Age of Piety. The chapters between William I, 1066, and the Tudors, Henry VIII, etc., are always called the Middle Ages, on account their coming at the beginning. This was also the age of piety, since religious fervour was then at its height, people being burnt alive, the stake, 2, bricked up in the walls of convents, religious foundations, and 3, tortured in dungeons, the confessional. All of this was not only pious, but a good thing, as many of the people who were burnt, bricked, tortured, etc., became quite otherworldly. Nowadays, people are not so pious, even heretics, being denied the benefits of fervent religion. Chapter 17. Richard I, a wild king. Richard I was a hairy king, with a lion's heart. He went roaring about the desert, making ferocious attacks on the Saladins and the Paladins, and thus was very romantic king. Whenever he returned to England, he always set out again immediately for the Mediterranean, and he was therefore known as Richard Gare de Lion. He had a sword of enormous dimensions, with which he used to practice cutting iron bars and anvils in half, whereas the Saladins had very sharp swords, which were only useful for cutting cushions in half, in spite of which the Crusaders under Richard never got Jerusalem back. This was undoubtedly due to the treacherous behaviour of the Saladins, who used to fire on the red cross which the Crusaders wore on their chests in battle. The story of Blondin. Richard is also famous for having a minstrel boy, or touraleur, called Blondin, who searched for him under the walls of all the dungeons in Europe. This was when Richard had become caught by the blind king of Bohemia during a game of blind king's bluff, and sold to the Holy Roman Terror. Blondin eventually found him by singing the memorable song, or tourelay, called "O Richard est mon droit," "Are you right there, Richard?" which Richard himself had composed. Richard roared the chorus so that Blondin knew which dungeon he was in, and thus the king easily escaped and returned to the Crusades, where he died soon after. A surfeit of Saladins was therefore known as the East as Richard Coeur de la Tour. Chapter 18. John, an awful king. When John came to the throne, he lost his temper and flung himself on the floor, foaming at the mouth and biting the rushes. He was thus a bad king. Indeed, he had begun badly, as a bad prince, having attempted to answer the Irish question. The Irish question at this time consisted of some Norman barons who lived in a pale, near Dublin, 2, the natives and the Irish chieftains, who were beyond the pale, living in bogs, beards, etc., by pulling the beards of the aged Irish chiefs, and was a bad thing and the wrong answer. Prince Arthur, a tragedy in little. John had a little nephew called Little Arthur, who was writing a little history of England in quite a small dungeon, and whose little blue eyes John had ordered to be put out with some weeny red-hot irons. The jailer Hubert, however, who was a good man, wept so much that he put out the red-hot irons instead. John was therefore compelled to do the little deed himself with a large, smallish knife, thus becoming the first memorable wicked uncle. The Bull. John was so bad that the Pope decided to put the whole country under an interdict, i.e., he gave orders that no one was to be born or die or marry, except in church porches. But John was still not cured of his badness, so the Pope sent a bull to England to excommunicate John himself. In spite of the king's efforts to prevent it, the bull succeeded in landing, and gave orders that John himself was not to be born or marry or die, except in church porches, that no one was to obey him or stand him or drink or tell him the right time or the answer to the Irish question or anything nice. So at last John gave way, and his subjects began once more to be born and to marry and die, etc., etc. Chapter 19. Magna Charta. There also happened in this reign the memorable charter known as Magna Charta, on account of the Latin magna, great, and charter, a charter. This was the first of the famous charters of the garters of the realm, and was invented by the barons on a desert island in the Thames called Ganymede. By congregating there, armed to the teeth, the barons compelled John to sign the Magna Charta, which said, first, that no one was to be put to death, save for some reason, except the common people. 2. That everybody should be free, except the common people. Thirdly, that everything should be of the same weight and measure throughout the realm, except the common people. Fourthly, that the courts should be stationary, instead of following a very tiresome medieval official known as a king's person all over the country. Fifthly, that no person should be fined to his utter ruin, except the king's person. And sixthly, that the barons should not be tried, except by a special jury of other barons who would understand. Magna Charta was therefore the chief cause of democracy in England, and thus a good thing for everybody, except the common people. After this, King John hadn't a leg to stand on, and was therefore known as John Lackshanks. Final acts of misgovernment. John finally demonstrated his utter incompetence by losing the crown and all his clothes in the wash, and then dying on a surfeit of peaches and no cider. Thus his awful reign came to an end. Chapter 20. Robin Hood and his merry men. About this time, the memorable hero Robin Hood flourished in a romantic manner. Having been unjustly accused by 2 policemen in Richmond Park, he was condemned to be an outdoor, and went and lived with a maid who was called Marian, and a band of merry men in Greenwood Forest near Sherborne. Among his merry men were Will Scarlet, the Scarlet Pimpernel, Black Beauty, White Melville, Little Red Riding Hood, probably an out-daughter of his, and the famous Friar Puck, who used to sit in a cowslip and suck bees, thus becoming so fat that he declared he could put his girdle round the earth. Robin Hood was a miraculous shot with a longbow, and it is said that he could split a hare at 400 paces, and a sheriff at 800. He therefore spent his time blowing a horn and shooting at the Sheriff of Nottingham, who was an outwit. He always used to sound his horn first, particularly when shooting round a corner. This showed his sportsmanship, and also enabled him to shoot the sheriff running, which was more difficult. Robin Hood was also very good at socialism, and often took money away from rich clergymen and gave it to the poor, who loved him for his generosity. He died very romantically, having taken some medicine supplied by his wicked aunt, and feeling his strength going, he blew a dying blast on his horn, with his dying breath fired, at last shot out of his bedroom window, and hit the Sheriff of Nottingham again. Chapter 21. Henry III, a nondescript king. Henry III was a confused kind of king, and is only memorable for having seized all the money in the mint. imprisoned himself in the Tower of London, and finally flung himself into the bosom of the Pope. While he was in the Tower, Henry III wrote a letter to the nation, saying that he was a good thing. This so confused the Londoners that they armed themselves with staves, jerkins, etc., and massacred the Jews in the city. Later, when he was the Pope's bosom, Henry further confused the people by presenting all the bonny faces of the church to Italians, and the whole reign was rapidly becoming less and less memorable when one of the barons, called Simon de Montfort, saved the situation by announcing that he had a memorable idea. Simon de Montfort's good idea. Simon de Montfort's idea was to make the Parliament more representative by inviting one or two vergers, or vergies, to come from every parish, thus causing the only good Parliament in history. The barons. Simon de Montfort, though only a Frenchman, was thus a good thing, and is very notable as being the only good baron in history. The other barons were of course all wicked barons. They had, however, many important duties under the manorial system. These were, firstly, to be armed to the teeth, and secondly, to extract from the villenage, saccage and soccage, tollage and tallage, pillage and eulage, and in extreme cases, all other manorial amenities such as umbrage and porridge. These may be collectively defined as the manorial rights of carnage and wreckage. Thirdly, to hasten the king's death, disposition, insanity, etc., and make quite sure that they were always at least 3 false claimants to the throne. Fourthly, to resent the attitude of the church. The barons were secretly jealous of the church, which they accused of encroaching on their rights. And fifthly, to keep up the Middle Ages. Note, in order to clear up the general confusion of the period, it is customary to give, at this point, a genealogical table of the kings, and even some queens of England. As these tables are themselves somewhat confusing, the one which follows has been, to a certain extent, rationalized, and will, the editors hope, prove to be exceptionally memorable.